Republicans demanding some answers after classified documents were found at President Biden's former office just days before the midterms. The materials are from his time as vice president, and a new report says they include intelligence assessments about Ukraine, Iran, and the UK. The White House claims the documents were immediately handed over to the National Archives, and Biden's attorneys are cooperating with the DOJ. The president, however, does not seem too eager to talk about any of it.
Who we want to thank.
Any comment on the document, sir?
Representatives.
Top GOP lawmakers claim there is a double standard at play after the FBI raid on Mar-a-Lago.
President Biden said during the campaign that he would be he would have the most transparent administration in America. Yet we find out this happened November the 2nd, days before the midterm elections, and no one found out about it. I'm not going to be quick to judge. I just know that he said it was very irresponsible for President Trump to take classified document to his personal residence and have them in an unsecured location, and it appears he did the same thing.
And some in the media are quick to dismiss the story.
The brief euphoria on the right that this would somehow, exonerate Trump by whataboutism. It's already turning into a bit of a hangover because of the stark contrast between the actions of the current president and the former guy when it comes to classified material.
We all know that Trump is a liar and a thief. We don't think that Biden is a liar and a thief, so we give him the benefit of the doubt.
You're already hearing them equate it to what happened with former President Trump, even though it is very an apples to oranges situation.
Jesse, you broke this news to me in a commercial break yesterday, and I looked at it and thought, I had two thoughts. First, I thought it was a joke, like, oh, is this like from The Onion or Babylon Bee? The second thing I thought was, if you're in the communications office and they have to call you and tell you this, you immediately just want to throw up your hands. Like, I don't know what I can do for you here.
How dare Rachel Maddow sneer at exoneration through whataboutism? That is the cornerstone of what I do here, and I will be doing it very effectively. I just want to take this slowly. So, intelligence reports dealing with Ukraine, Britain, and Iran. And these were taken out right when he was leaving the vice presidency. So Ukraine, what he's trying to hide from the incoming Trump administration, obviously. The British intelligence document's interesting because this was the whole Christopher Steele deal with the Russia collusion. And Iran, what was Donald Trump going to do with Iran? He was going to nuke the nuke deal. So he didn't want the Trump administration to have his dirty little hands on any of those things. So he disappears with the documents. And the Biden Center for Diplomacy, they call it a think tank, which is
generous.
They don't open for an oxymoron. They don't open for a year. So where are the documents that are classified for an entire year? And then who moves those documents into this think tank, if you can call it that? Now, also, at the last week of the Biden vice presidency, where was Biden? Biden was in Ukraine. Biden went all the way over to Ukraine for some reason, and that prosecutor was fired, and Burisma gives a load of money to the Atlantic Council. Everything just kind of wraps up in a nice bow. So then they open the Biden Center with Chinese money. He announces he's doing the Biden Center at UPenn, and all of a sudden, China quadruples their donations to the University of Pennsylvania. A lot of it anonymous. So they open up this big center, $65, $75 million donations flooding in. And the Biden Center, and UPenn specifically, of all the institutions in the Ivy League, is the most pro-China. It has the biggest relationship with the Chinese, and their mantra is basically like, we can't decouple from China. China's great. And the Biden Center is at the forefront of this big effort. Now, in terms of the national security implications here, where do you think the Chinese have greater access? To a think tank, 15-minute bike ride from the Chinese embassy in Washington, D.C., or a basement at Mar-a-Lago on an island in Florida guarded by the Secret Service? I wonder if the janitors at the Biden Center were Chinese operatives. I can only guess, but I feel like that's just a little bit more suspicious. And there's also these other emails coming out from the Hunter laptop. They were looking at the Biden Center as basically the Clinton Global Initiative.
Yes.
And I think Hunter Biden was going to have an office there. Now, why does Hunter Biden need an office at the Biden Center when he already has this other office that he's sharing with the Chinese in Georgetown? A lot of centers And you can never get anything out of these centers. You know, they have declassified information at this one, and then they have all the documents about the rape accusation from that woman when he was a senator. They have those locked under guarded key at the University of Delaware. It's like every institution that Biden's associated with has some sort of national security or criminal implication. So I'm just, I'm keeping an open mind, as Harold would say.
Yes, and Harold, what about that? What aboutism?
It's good to be back around the table.
Yeah, it's great to have you back.
I'd say a couple of things. I think Jesse's raised a lot of interesting points, and I think a lot of questions have to be answered. I'm not certain that Penn is the most extensive ties. I think Harvard may actually have more students from China, but I think I know where you're going, and it does not at all mitigate answers that I think have to be answered, questions that need to be asked, and questions that deserve answers. I'd say 4 other things very quickly. What I'm most interested in all of this is how did it happen? I think we need to trace the chain of custody here, and I hope that from a legal standpoint, Judge, that certainly is something that has to be done right away. 2, did President Biden, when he was then citizen Biden, before he was president, did he ever review those documents? I think that question, if he did, he would have known that they were there and that they should have been returned. And if he did review them, did he know that they were classified? Did someone tell him they should be returned? I think if he reviewed them, he should have certainly known because they were listed that way. 3, how secure were the documents? Because some of the concerns that people had about the documents being at Mar-a-Lago was that, at least from what we've heard from the archivists and federal law enforcement agencies, the federal law enforcement agency, the FBI, is that they didn't think that those things were secure enough. And finally, have they checked extensively and exhaustively to ensure that there are no other documents there? I know one distinguishing factor here is that President Biden's team apparently self-reported. And if they self-reported on this, I've read some reports where they looked in other boxes. And I'm hopeful if they did look in other boxes that they have exhaustively done this search here. But politically, Danny, you're right. This is you would hate to get that call yesterday. But these things happen, and I look forward to hearing the president's answers to these questions and perhaps others.
We'll see if he gets one. There's going to be a press conference in a little bit. Judge, what about the action the Attorney General took? He said, okay, well, now somebody is going to have to look into this as well.
Yeah. You know, I don't trust the Attorney General enough to say that he's probably going to recommend a special prosecutor. He's not going to do that. I think that the points that Harold raised are excellent. Number 1, the attorney stumbled upon these top secret stuff that you could only read in a SCIF that are marked classified, okay? Number 2, they have been there for 6 years in a facility that is not locked, that is not secured. We have no idea how many people had access to or actually looked at these documents that were marked. And it was not only not secure, but it was an academic institution. Anyone could have had access to that office. And my question is, why now? Were they moving the office? I understand they were moving the office. And then they said they turned it over immediately. Immediately after what? After who saw it? Who saw it first? What is immediate? And how many people saw it? I want to know, under oath, how many people saw it? What other classified information is there? I'm not going to rely on them saying it was only this amount, and this small amount is not the issue. The issue is very clear. You do not have the right to take that classified information and put it in a non-classified facility, okay? That is the violation, whether it's 1 or 160. Right now, they're admitting to 10 or 12 or whatever the number is. So it's not allowed, period. So don't tell me the media, there's nothing to see here, folks, nothing to see here. At least Mar-a-Lago was protected by the Secret Service. This is Penn. This is an academic institution. And the truth is, Ukraine, you know, as I recall, President Trump was impeached over a phone call to the Ukraine trying to find out what Joe Biden did when he threatened the prosecutor to get off a case of a company that his son was working for. And by the way, as vice president, he didn't have power to declassify. So he's got none of those defenses. And, you know, the man who couldn't wait to call Trump irresponsible now can't answer the question. Right. He can't answer any question. And finally, the whataboutism. I'd like to do a whataboutism with Hillary Clinton. She still is the worst. 33,000 emails. They were all classified. When everybody asked her where they were, she simply destroyed them.
Yep. Also, why isn't the media mad about the timing? Because apparently this was known before the midterm elections.
I know.
Nobody
Isn't
cares
that
about
weird?
that.
And what a surprise that it came out now. All these delays seem to only go in one direction. Where are the shocking photographs that are set up like court evidence? Right. But I said this a couple of days ago, Payback is a Hillary Clinton. and I want to know when the raids start. I want to see what's in their underwear drawer and if it's disposable. I know that the media's response is that, with Trump, it's treason. Yeah. Or worse than Watergate, and with Joe Biden, it's a nothing suppository. We see that coming as well. We knew this would happen. We're not stupid, but we're different, right? They may be right. This might be a nothing burger. And we felt that Trump's was a nothing burger, but we never change our story based on the team that we support. We know that this is probably, in my view, I would always think that the person who ever packed that stuff in there probably just packed stuff in there. Do you ever have a mover and they come to your house and then you're unpacking and they packed singularly a disposable spoon from takeout and it's all packed in newspaper? Like, what are you doing? So who knows? It could be some idiot who did that. But the thing is, I would not be doing my job if I didn't raise the important questions that need to be raised about what actually happened. Do we know that there aren't nuclear secrets in there? Perhaps he exchanged nuclear secrets to China for the 10%. Huh? That's a question worth raising. What if he has Barack Obama's real birth certificate?
Oh, no.
And that's what got him the VP job.
The blackmail.
He's been blackmailing the blackmailed. But if this is true, and by the way, just raising some questions, documents vital to national security, he needs to be frog-marched, Joe Biden, into prison immediately. No bail for him. And if it turns out he's a traitor, I'm just going to go by what all those talking heads on CNN and MSNBC said and prescribed about Trump. I'm not going to go for anything more than what they suggested.
Hi, everyone. I'm Brian Kilmeade. I want you to do me a favor. I want you to click to subscribe to the Fox News YouTube page. This is the only way that I know for sure that you're not going to miss any great commentary, any great news bites, any great interviews coming your way on Fox. You can get it all here on YouTube. So subscribe right now.